Hey, it's Lil Jason.
Oh,
Now I'm playing.
Gucci gang.
Everyone using Lil before
That's
their
it.
names.
Lil Pump.
Hey,
Yeah.
Lil Pump, what up?
Gucci gang.
Hey,
Hey, stop! Why?
The miasma spreads through the air, and as it is breathed in, the human being becomes possessed of sickness.
I'm not sure that's how it works.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Fuck you mean, B?
It was 1813. Napoleon had just retreated from Russia, and the Industrial Revolution in England was
Biggest rapper to come up on the block.
cholera. You see, cholera had its roots in India, crept its way up to Russia, then crawled westward through Europe, first making its way to London and then to Newcastle in 1831. But so many were struck so fast by the disease that the doctor
Find a dead person in a suicide
was
forest.
overloaded. And so it was at the age of 18 that Jon Snow was sent alone into the horror of the coal slums to treat the coal workers dying of this disease. And make no mistake, cholera is one of the most terrifying diseases out there. It doesn't cause the unimaginable mortality rate of the plague, smallpox, or even some strains of influenza, but it's a horrific disease to contract. A disease whose horror is in how it manifests, how it takes over a person's body. It is swift and utterly wretched. Cholera can take a healthy person and leave them a husk overnight, and its onset is sudden. A person can be walking down the street, and then all of a sudden they'll grab their stomach and fall to the ground, spewing vomit and diarrhea. They'll continue to expel diarrhea at up to 20 liters a day until their skin becomes turgid and their blood turns to sludge, becoming too dehydrated and thick to circulate due to how much fluid the person's lost. Then the organs shut down one by one, and the person dies not directly because of an action of the disease, but because they've lost so much fluid that their body can no longer form the plasma it needs to keep itself alive. And all the things Jon Snow had learned as an apprentice achieved nothing. From house to house he'd walk, trying to apply every technique known to medicine at the time to treat the sick. Bleeding, opium, strong herbs to keep off the miasma. All of these things had no effect, and patient after patient died. Even when he tried giving them water, no matter how much water he gave them, they'd appear better for a few short hours. Then they would soon sink back down to torpor, and finally death. So, despite his training, one by one as he made his rounds, he left his patients' blue-pale corpses behind. His idea to rehydrate them was correct, but the medical community was only just beginning to understand that the excessive diarrhea not only caused a loss of water, but a loss of sodium as well, which is a key component of blood plasma. And it wouldn't be until the 20th century that the major breakthrough was made, when it was discovered that drinking glucose would help a cholera-ravaged intestinal system take up the saline it so desperately needed. And so Jon Snow's patients died. But as an apprentice, he'd kept meticulous journals with his observations and theories. He had seen that coal workers would often be struck down by cholera deep in the coal pits, far from the graveyards, swamps, or sewage pools that the infectious miasma was thought to seep from. So he hypothesized that there must be something else going on. He didn't know exactly what, but he tried to express to local doctors that rather than miasma, there was something that could persist in water and be transmitted from person to person that caused disease. And they all told him, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." And so, as the cholera epidemic eventually passed, as mysteriously as it had come, Jon Snow moved on to other work, but he had never forgotten cholera, that specter that had been burned into him in his youth.
I am
And in
coming
1848,
for
when
the
John was
booty.
35, cholera returned to haunt London. This time, he was determined not to let it win. He knew cholera wasn't just the result of bad air, and he was determined to prove it. He reached out to all of his connections in the medical community and tracked down the first case of the new outbreak, a sailor named John Harnold. He had a lead. He went and immediately talked to the physician who treated Mr. Harnold, only to find out that he had treated another man in the exact same room Mr. Harnold rented 8 days after Mr. Harnold died. The case was afoot. John suspected contagion, perhaps from soiled bed linens that had gone unwashed after the first death. Not miasma from some poison floating in the air. No, this disease was transferred from one man to another. He was sure of it. He just needed proof. Cases began to pop up all over London, and he raced from one lead to the next, interviewing patients and physicians to see if he could draw the link. He was told by one person after another that the pain started in their intestines, which led him to believe that the disease must be caused by something they ingested rather than something they inhaled. Otherwise, wouldn't the disease start in the nose or the throat or the lungs? So, obviously not all of his reasoning was perfect, but it did lead him down the right path in this case. He theorized that the diarrhea caused by cholera might not only be a symptom, but also how the disease was spread. Now, because the term germs was frowned upon by many in the medical profession at the time, he started writing about how cholera was caused by a self-multiplying poison found in the water contaminated by fecal matter. He did a case study. He found a street where, on one side, all the waste poured out by the residents flowed toward the well they got their drinking water from, whereas on the other side, the waste flowed away from their well. He surveyed all those living on either side of the street. On the side where the well water mixed with the sewage, almost all of the inhabitants were laid low. On the other side of the street, only one person succumbed to cholera. He had it. He had his proof. He wrote furiously, detailing it all out, and then raced to the presses. He'd done it! His pamphlet circulated the city. The most learned minds of the day heard what he'd discovered. And they said, "You know nothing, Jon Snow.